Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another webinar in our cybersecurity series. Our facilitator is Prasad Kalyam, Director at the University of Missouri for Director of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. And he'll be able to share who's on here with him as guest speakers. So take it away, Prasad.
Thank you, Brittany. Let me share my screen. So good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome back. This is our fourth webinar in the 5-webinar series on defending small business cyber assets. And today's webinar will focus on outsmarting your adversary. So I am Prasad Kalyam. I am an associate professor at the University of Missouri in the Computer Science Department, and I also direct the Mizzou's Cyber Education Research Infrastructure Center, which is Mizzou CERI. And I have the pleasure with me to have two distinguished cybersecurity experts, Jason Rinker from Stronghold Data and Angie Robinson from the Missouri Office of Homeland Security. Welcome. And I have two excellent teaching assistants, Roshan and Songji, who also helped me put together this content for today's presentation. So here are our kind of teaching team for you today, and we're looking forward to engaging with you. And today's talk, as I said, is made possible by funding from the Small Business Administration, and it's hosted by the Missouri Small Business Development Center. And the goal here is to make businesses aware of modern cybersecurity threats and help them, have the necessary knowledge and skills so they can plan a cyber defense strategy. And hopefully the plan helps in increase productivity, cost savings, and reduce cyber risk. And this is a follow-up to 3 past webinars. The first webinar we talked about understanding your business cybersecurity position. So we looked at what are the modern cyber attacks, how do we know what assets need to be protected, and what defense do we already have, and what are the gaps? So that was kind of where we left with the first webinar. In the second webinar, we actually looked at how to come up with some security solutions with some design principles that are following best practices. And we showed that picking a solution is ultimately a business decision, but there are several best practices that can be adopted. And what would make sense is something we discussed in the webinar 2. And in webinar 3, we actually talked a lot about how to get ready to face the adversary. So having an intrusion detection system and knowing what kind of attacks could be detected in different ways using data-driven techniques and tools to really have a detection system and an action plan beginning to be set up. And so in today's webinar, we'll actually talk really about what the defense strategies could be in terms of firewalls, in terms of techniques you could use to defend against cyber attacks. And the one that's coming up last is going to talk a lot about risk assessment, risk management, and maintaining a risk profile that you as a business are comfortable with. So this is what we call as maintaining a resilient security position, because you cannot be 100% risk-free. So there's going to be an attack, you will be attacked. And we are going to be as prepared as we can, and we will invest as much we can. That makes sense. And so how to keep that investment and risk profile in a situation that we're comfortable with is part of the next webinar that's coming up next Wednesday. So please look out for that. So with that, I'd like to get into what we want to do today. We'll start with a little engaging session, talking about what we want to learn today, what you are already familiar with about things that we're going to talk today. So we'll engage you in the beginning, and then we'll get into some interesting concepts that we'd like you to listen, watch, and learn. And then we'll have some feedback and discussion from the cybersecurity experts, and have a little breakout session on an important topic on denial of service attacks that we'll talk about today. And then I'll have some more conceptual talks and we'll show you a live demo and of a defense mechanism called moving target defense today. And we'll then get into a small exercise to wrap everything up to apply some of the learning we did today in a realistic setting. And then we'll close strong. So with that, I'd like to start our engage session. So the learning objectives for today will be to learn about how we defend against various modern cyber attacks and how we can develop plans to protect your network, your data, and your resources that are used for computing, and really put some access control so you can control any accidents or insider attacks even in your small business, right? So how do we do that is some of the concepts we'll talk about today. So we'll start with your network asset defense, then we'll go into some of your data computing assets defense, and then we'll talk about access controls. And as I said, we'll have a live demonstration of a moving target defense of a real application. So you can kind of see how defense is done right in practice. So Brittany, are we ready for the opening questionnaire poll? Thank you.
Yep.
So here are some 4 questions we'd like you to answer. And we've talked about ransomware attacks a bit in the past. This time we're going to talk about a newer set of attacks that we've not talked before in depth, which is DDoS attacks, SQL-Injection, cross-site scripting. So I just was wondering how familiar you are with it. And then obviously firewalls, as we all know, are a important perimeter defense mechanism for our enterprises that keeps the inside of the network safe from the outside. So I'm wondering, are you familiar with what are the benefits and sometimes limitations of firewalls? Why firewalls are not always all of your security strategy, right? It is part of your strategy, but it's got its own limitations. And then obviously authentication, authorization are critical issues we're going to talk about today. I'm wondering how many businesses actually have the investment to do multi-factor authentication for critical assets that they're trying to protect, and also if they have any automation technology that is essential to do access control. So for authorization of privileges to access the assets. So thanks for filling out the results. So Brittany, can we post these? So great. So it's good to see many of you know what are some of these attacks and limitations of firewalls. So definitely there's some discussion we need to have about firewalls, multi-factor authentication, and authorization using access control. So very good. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. And let's get into the conceptual part of our presentation. So let's first get into, as I said, thinking about how we defend your network assets. And what do I mean by that? Today, most small businesses, are pretty technologically sophisticated. I would say you're using a lot of cloud applications, and you have a lot of experts who are distributed, and you probably have a lot of data that's very critical for your business. And here's an example of a small business that I worked with in Columbus, Ohio, actually in Dublin, Ohio. And the company's name was called Total Sim. So it started off with 6 or 7 employees, and during my time working with them, they grew to more than a couple of dozen employees. So it's a very big success story, and their success was driven by their adoption of technology, especially like cloud computing, and using data modeling and simulation essentially to sell new products to their customers in Ohio, in Honda, for example, in North Carolina to some companies. And so they had this excellent growth that was driven by adopting technology and adopting essentially cloud-based systems and leveraging the cloud to bring in distributed expertise. So they had experts from UK and California and other places. They were able to bring all of them together, collaborate through the cloud, and be very successful. So This company is a good example of a small business. May not be the typical small business, but the way I see it is, technology, data, and distributed expertise is the reality of today. All the experts are not going to be in one location. We are not able to put all the technology we need in one data center within our buildings. That's not going to happen forever, right? So we're increasingly using cloud-based technologies, and we want to do more of what we want to do in the business and not worry about computers, network, security, storage, data. So we are hopefully going towards solutions of automation, but then those are all bringing in more of these networked assets that are opening up new attack surfaces for threats, right? So this is a typical attack, target for somebody who is outside looking at, compromising a business and trying to get a ransom, right? So we talked about some of these ransomware attacks or attacks we've seen with the Colonial Pipeline most recently, and we've talked about the Sony hack, which is called the hack of the century by Fortune magazine. We talked about that, and we've talked about other kind of attacks, but in every case, we have seen that the motivated hackers are highly organized and very, very dangerous because they are able to really bring high impact critical threats that really can damage a business severely. In the Sony case, as we saw, they literally had to re-establish their entire network devices, and there was a lot of aftermath that was very, very expensive in terms of reputation as well as cost to the company, right? So so the fact is that we are dealing with an adversary who has significant resources. They possess access to these large underground economies where they can get services, even with the customer service, to make sure that their attack is succeeding, right? And if they're not, then they can get help for that. So they have access to compromised hosts and stored information and lots of toolkits, attack kits, we call them, to launch attacks. So given that this is sort of the adversary we are seeing, the consequences are obvious, right? So we talked a lot of times about ransomware attacks, and these are attacks where the attacker essentially, we also call it the advanced persistent threat. They find a way to get into your system. They lay low till they find an asset that they know compromising will really get you to give them a ransom, right? And so once they have identified the asset and successfully compromise it, in some cases encrypting it, then they will ask you to basically pay up, or they will permanently destroy the encryption key, or they will threaten to expose your data, right? So and this has worked a lot, which is unfortunate, and many, even the Colonial Pipeline case, we saw the ransom was already paid out before it became public. And so obviously we talked about how some of these things you could be doing if this happened, in terms of having good backups, having a good appropriate incident response and disaster recovery plan. So we talked about it in the previous webinar, but this is one thing we've talked a lot. It's much in the news. The other one, which is also sensational, which is kind of in the news, like we talked about the Sony hack, but again, this is something that routinely happens, but there's again a lot of defenses in place if you are working with a cloud provider, and we'll talk a little bit more about the denial of service attack today. In fact, we'll go in considerable depth and we'll show you an attack and a defense also in a live demonstration. So here is an attack where the attack is on making your system's availability, right, basically become zero, right? They take your service offline. So we call it a loss of availability attack, and it impairs your systems, networks, applications, and the goal here is to exhaust all the resources by trying to overwhelm your applications or services with a number of sessions, right? That would look like real users, but they are essentially malicious, like you can see in this picture, and it's usually organized around a network of worms or bots that essentially hit the target server and consume all the resources. And so the legitimate users then are shut out. And all you need is a network connection to launch this attack, right? So this is attack that's easily launchable, and it's a common attack, and it's good to know about it. And the fact that it can be distributed, so you have these botnets that have all of these attack target launching sites, right? Coordinated by the attacker is sort of makes the problem really, really severe, and we call them flooding attacks, right? And these applications are basically a surprise. They just hit you. When they hit you, they hit you. And can you do much about it? So we'll talk about it. And the unfortunate answer is no. And the fortunate answer is you can do something. And we'll talk about both of it today. And another couple of attacks that I want to bring your attention to is more what I call as code or data injection attacks. So these are different from some of these ransomware or the availability attacks, right? Here in this case, it could be a web application, and it could be you're asking for user inputs, but those fields, if they're not rigorously filtered, could be used to send commands that could take over your database, and they could take a copy of your database or modify your database. So they could do many bad things. And this is a very well-known attack. There are lots of defense systems in place, but still, this is a very much an example of an attack of a data or a code injection where your web applications can be compromised if they're not secure, and those could be used to gain, like we talked, privilege escalation to really do much damage to assets that you're protecting behind your web applications. And the last one, which I really want to again show you and get your attention to, is this idea of cross-site scripting attacks. And this is something you probably have experienced. We also call them as drive-by downloads, where you go to a website, and in fact, that website takes you to another website that then has a sort of a malicious code or activity that affects your computer. And this is again a result of just the way we've used technology with dynamic websites and the attackers being able to inject code again, right, into your systems. Even though you're visiting a good website, the attackers find a bug to download, install your malware, and that could be again a cyber attack, which is significant in your system. And so we kind of touched upon this point that it's a dangerous world. The adversary is very sophisticated. The attacks are very sophisticated. And the modern attacks, as we've seen, attackers have been successful in getting ransoms or really causing a lot of distress to businesses. And so having a plan is a start, and that's what we emphasized. And we talked about a plan having a set of security objectives and having some policies, and ultimately, like we said, having a risk profile that we're comfortable with. We cannot completely be immune to all attacks, but at least we can start with knowing what assets need to be protected, how are those threatened, and then what can we do to counter those. And in one of the talks, I said, this is great, but this is really not the right answer, right? The right answer is it has to be iterative. So you have to keep doing this. You have to find a way to know what are the assets that need to be protected and how are those threatened. Based on that, again, you need to go revisit your assets. Again, once you know what assets are threatened, you might have to understand what could be done to counter them, at which point you might have to go back and again look at what assets need to be protected and how you're protecting them. So it's going to be a cyclic process, an iterative process, and an ongoing process, which is kind of the difficult part. So you need an ongoing investment and plan that's updated based on the realities of technology, realities of the attackers that are emerging, and realities of the new devices or management actions you're doing in your IT systems that will require to reassess all of these things. So we did discuss a little bit of that. And the point, Jason, again, I want him to jump in, please, Jason, talking about risk, right? At the end of the day, it's about prioritizing risks and finding a way to respond to those risks and monitoring those risks and having a plan, right, Jason?
That is correct. You know, your risk assessment is where it all starts for any organization. A couple of things I'd like to add from earlier in this presentation. You were talking about the people behind, like, the denial of service attacks. You know, a lot we see from those organizations you listed, Prasad, but I mean, it can be as minor as somebody leveraging the denial of service as a service. That, you know, you can go on the dark web and you can buy some. In fact, we had a case where a high school student went on the dark web, purchased for $20 a distributed denial of service. He launched that from his Google Chromebook that the school issued, and it disrupted the service of the local internet service provider for quite some time. So it's not very hard, and it's pretty easy, and can really bring down some organizations. And that's brings me back to why these risk assessments are so critical for every organization. And you just got to go through this process. And I like this graphic that you have here, Prasad, and it really is a step-by-step process. And I think Angie could even speak to some of that risk assessment from her agency's side.
Yeah, so we do tell people and advocate that they do a risk assessment. We like to share the ones that CISA will do for you, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency. They're free of cost, and they have different assessments, ones that start at places that have never had an assessment. Those smaller businesses and smaller agencies that maybe only have one IT person, or not that many. So we ask that they do those, and a lot of times they will find things that they didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. So once that risk assessment has been done, they'll identify their risk and where their gaps are, and then that will lead to having more security controls. Daniel, yes, those assessments are available online. If you go to CISA.gov, CISA.gov, you'll find, and go to their cybersecurity link, they will have a whole section there on assessments for you. They also have a free assessment called the NCSR, the Nationwide Cybersecurity Review. And I know from my office, the grants come down from the feds from us, and then we distributed them in Missouri to the agencies that apply for them. And to get any of that grant money, they have to do the NCSR. And that can also be done for anybody that wants to do the NCSR. It's free of charge, and it's all, and you do it yourself, and then you turn it into CISA, and they identify your gaps. That is also on the CISA website as well.
Thank you, Angie. Yeah, I think, next webinar, we're going to actually go more into the depth of what a risk assessment looks like, formally, informally. We'll do like a small exercise and give you a more detailed, comprehensive strategy that you could do. There are consultants, like free ones that Angie was talking about, paid consultants. So it's a very important step in businesses. So the next webinar, I think it's a good teaser, is going to focus much more on especially that topic. But in this webinar, I want to focus on the control actions like Angie was talking about, right? So we can determine what are the risks we want to respond to. So how do we put some controls in place, some security controls, and figure out what it is that we want to do in terms of mitigating the risk, and what control would be relevant, and having an implementation of that control, and monitoring whether our controls are working, correct? So that's going to be our focus today. And just to define what's a security control, right? It is an action, a device, a procedure, or a measure that reduces the risk, right? So we're trying to reduce the risk we have identified. We're trying to reduce the risk and try to prevent a security violation for a known risk, and minimize the harm that could be caused by discovering and even maybe taking some kind of a corrective action with the security control. So obviously, firewalls are a very, very popular security control. We've all learn to live with them on our personal PCs, in our networks, and if you even go to the cloud, when you set up an instance, you'll deal with your instance firewall. So we've known firewalls as an effective way to secure anything that's connected to the internet that has these attack threats, right? And definitely they have been effective for a large part in protecting our local area networks from the internet. So if the internet is the adversary and our local area network is our home, we're trying to protect our home with the firewall against the adversary who's outside. And so we place the firewall, as you can see here, between the internal premises of the network and the internet connection point of our network. And it could be one firewall, it could be a collection of firewalls, and we try to isolate the systems from the outside where we think the adversary is, and use the firewall as a single point or a choke point to impose security, and we can audit what's coming in, what's going out, right? And this sort of perimeter defense is a very successful way to start with security controls for your business. But firewalls have some limitations, right? So they're definitely good to make sure whatever is coming inside is blocked and whatever is going out from the network is passed through. So all your users are able to do what they can, but the adversary is stopped from outside. But your firewall is as good as your policies, right? You can come up with a local security policy and you can decide what is allowed to pass and not allowed to pass. And if that policy is not good, your users might not be able to do things that they want to do, right? And that can cause some friction. But it's a starting point, and we should know that firewalls cannot protect you against attacks that many times can bypass the firewall, like advanced persistent threats, as we talked about, that could happen for a number of reasons. So it could be internal attacks, or it could be wireless LANs that are accessed from outside the organization that are not secured. It could be a laptop or some kind of a device that's infected outside, that's brought into the company, inside the corporate network physically, and then when it's connected, that could essentially compromise your local network, and the firewall can not do much about it. And here is a research that I did a few years back, where we found firewalls are not immune to penetration. The firewalls themselves can be compromised. So we saw that a typical enterprise has tens of thousands of rules, and if you don't have a proper counter strategy, if you have rules at the bottom of your firewall access list, if the attacker knows what those rules are, they can keep sending traffic that invokes those last matching rules, and then it brings your firewall to its knees. So there are ways in which firewalls themselves could be compromised. So again, they're not a perfect solution. So Jason, you want to add something to that?
Sure, Prasad. When I think of what you're sharing here with the firewall characteristics, one thing I want to add is that you have to update your firewall. The firmware, there's a lot of security patches. You really need to stay on top of that for all of your firewalls. We used to think that you could buy a firewall, put it in, and just forget about it. You can't do that anymore. In fact, we're seeing manufacturers that are coming out with new units that you need to almost look at replacing every 2 to 4 years, just to keep up with all the changes that they're making. So this firewall piece is very, very important, and you really do need to keep an eye on it. And just also review the logs from your firewall, and take some time to go through those. Yes, you may need to filter out some of the noise, but take the time to really understand those firewalls that's in there.
Great, thank you. And so let's move beyond just our network, right? So let's start talking about things within your network, which is your data, your computing assets that you're accessing, or even data and computing assets you're accessing outside that are in the cloud that belong to your enterprise, right? And here are some of the myths that we would hear many times, but we should understand, again, they're not completely true, right? So I have a firewall or an antivirus to fend off attacks, and yeah, it could be effective to mitigate some of these threats and isolate protect. But again, as we saw, firewalls are something that the hackers can bypass many times. They can take down the firewall also. And as Jason is saying, if you're not kept it update, and if you don't have good admin oversight, they're not going to be a formidable defense. And some of the attacks like session hijacking, like we talked about, cannot be detected by firewalls. So these go around the firewalls in some sense. And then the other part is if you have web applications and you say, hey, I have web security, it's handled by encryption, I have HTTPS, am I completely safe now? And again, the answer is encryption is not, again, completely a solution to all of your security problems. So it is definitely important part of your security control to make sure communication between source and destination are secure. But again, they're not effective against DDoS attacks, some of the SQL-Injection attacks, or attacks that are, again, caused due to fake SSL certificates, right? And then last but not least, you might say, hey, the data I'm working on is not worthwhile. Systems I'm working on are not worthwhile. Who might want to attack me, right? But that's exactly the problem. So you are the easy target because you may not be taking security seriously. And once you're hit, the impact is really bad. Whatever you're doing comes to a standstill, and it is panic. It is a lot of aftermath, like we talked about. And ransomware attacks are more and more frequent, impacting small business, even big organizations. So again, that's a myth that you're not a target.
Well, and you also just need to ask the question as a small business is, how important is that data to you? Because in the ransomware talk that Prasad was just referring to, they're locking you out from your data and asking you to pay to get that data back. Also, you think about the data that you're handling in a small business environment. Is that data, would it be valuable to your competitors? So that's why they use that data as an extortion method. So,
yeah. And so, there are many other vulnerabilities that we need to be aware of and know that one solution doesn't solve all the problems. And Jason has said that many times in different ways. It has to be a combination and it has to be a concerted effort that is implemented very strategically and monitored to put up a good defense, right? So weak passwords definitely are a big vulnerability. Like you had the code data injection, you can have operating system command injection. Your applications can have buffer overflow problems. You could have access controls that are misconfigured, like we'll talk later. There you give people more privileges than they should, which again opens up a new set of attack surfaces. And if you're not patching your systems or keeping your systems locked down to restrict some of the dangerous file types, you might be opening yourself up to attacks. So, definitely vulnerability myths are something we should be aware of. And, in most cases, organizations cannot really anticipate all of this. We might not have all the expertise. And Angie was saying, and Jason was pointing out that there are many people who can help. And there are professionals who can help. And this area is called as ethical hacking. And like Angie was saying, if you can do a risk assessment, or in some case, I'll talk about this idea called penetration testing. You have somebody actually, authorized, right, to take down your systems to see if your systems are resilient, right, and they can find out things that you might not have anticipated in terms of new worms, malwares, or other things that are multiplying these days, right? And so if you can hire or have some form of a service that you have where ethical hacking is authorized by your business, so you can find out what kind of vulnerabilities an attacker can see that you are not seeing. What information or system would a hacker most want to assess or access, and what can an attacker do with the information, and how many people notice the attack, and what's the best way to fix the vulnerability. So Jason, I remember you mentioning that you did this exercise in a company, and you did a social engineering attack, and you found a good percentage of employees actually falling for it, right?
Well, this ethical hacking could also be a form of what we do as a phishing, exercise for all of the employees. And thinking of an organization that had 143 employees, and out of that 143, they had 10 of them that clicked on the link. But the scary thing is in that phishing email, if you could click on the link and then it pulls up an opportunity for you to log in, which would be exposing your credentials. And there was another 7 employees that actually did that. So, a total of 17 instances out of 143, which would have invited that that threat into the organization. So this ethical hacking, where they can come in and do some, really looking at your hardware, some of the systems, but also you got to look at your other threats, and that is the people that work there, and then the third-party vendors. So you really need to take a very holistic approach when you're evaluating that under an ethical hacking.
Yeah, and like Jason said, somebody at the management said, "Hey, there's only 10 people who fell for it," and then Jason is like, "No, you just need one person to fall for it." And so that's the problem of, like we talked about in our previous webinars. The design of the security has to be comprehensive, but the attacker just has to find one vulnerability to really make entry into the system. So we talked about it as security by a shoestring, right? We showed like chains and locks and other parts, but then there's one part where there's a shoestring, and it's there you go, right? So yeah, and we should again know that ethical hacking is also not something which is completely legal and things like that, right? So we want to talk about the white hat hackers who we authorize to do these things in our enterprise, but there are people who are black hat hackers and gray hat hackers, and they are not ethical hackers in the sense that they are doing this to really cause harm, and in some cases just expose your data to show that you have a problem, right? And those are, again, problematic. But we're talking here about white hat hackers, right? Who we hire and we officially authorize them to penetrate, locate vulnerabilities so that we can fix them and have safety before the hackers get to them. So one of the things that the ethical hackers, the white hat hackers would do for you is what they call as penetration testing or pen testing. This is a very common exercise that's done where IT infrastructure is subjected to this sort of exploitation by giving written approval or permission to do so, and the ethical hacking is done at an operating system level, web application level, at a network level, at an end user level, right? Like we talked about from Jason's perspective, and our people in the business are an asset we protect and also are a liability who could compromise our business. And so they would identify these misconfigurations, risky user behavior, like Jason was talking, clicking on links, entering passwords they shouldn't be, and they will validate what defense mechanisms you already have and how good they're working. Right, and so your goal here is to find as much of these vulnerabilities before an attacker can actually come and launch and compromise. Right, so as a decision maker in your enterprise, you can use these as a way to again stay ahead of the attacker. So let's do a small exercise now to deepen our thinking. And again, don't get scared with this picture, but what I'm showing here is typically what is happening on the internet. We have small businesses, large businesses. They're all connected by the internet. We have internet service providers who are serving many users at homes and other places. And many of our systems are all connected to the cloud platforms, right? So this is kind of our internet composition today. We have small businesses, large businesses. We have large sets of consumer connectivity to our businesses, as well as cloud services that we are hosting. And cloud services are all interconnected to these systems. So, if you think about what kind of DDoS or DOS attack is possible here, I would imagine your answer should be everywhere, right? What DOS types are possible? Every kind, everywhere. So you can take a large company to bring down a smaller company. You can take all these broadband users, and we've seen these attacks where The wireless routers are compromised. Some of the IoT devices in these places are compromised, and they could be used to launch attacks on a small, medium, or a large company. The cloud can be used against your own enterprises, or your enterprises can be used to launch attacks into the cloud where your applications are. So all of these are possible. Just the fact that we have interconnectivity means attacks are possible. And you might say, well, can't I stop them? Because they're all going through this thing called the internet where there are routers, and maybe the routers can stop them. And the answer is maybe, maybe not, right? The problem here is we don't know which is legitimate traffic, which is attack traffic. And it's legally not a cool thing for somebody who's serving your internet traffic to block your traffic. So that's a big no-no. What if it was actual traffic that was getting you $1 million business, right? They don't want to be liable for that. So most of these times, these attacks end up at your doorstep, right? They come in and stop at your network. Nobody, even though they know sometimes it's an attack, they might not really want to stop it for legal reasons, or for the fact that it might be actually legitimate traffic. Maybe your business suddenly got viral and there's a lot of customers coming to your business. They don't want to stop that, right? So in that sense, it's really a tough game to be in if you're connected to the internet. If you're a small business or a medium business, or if you have applications in the cloud, you cannot prevent these denial of service attacks. And the only way most times is to wait for these attacks to go away. So that's unfortunate, but that's the truth of it, because as I just said, there is this issue of legitimacy of the traffic and really telling whether a sort of flows in the network are malicious or not is hard. And there's a story close to home. The city of Columbia once was hacked, and this denial of service attack was launched by this Bitcoin baron, who basically thought the city had supported a wrong cause. And the fact was that there was no way to stop this attack. So you just had to wait for this attack to go away. And the city had not put enough of budget to deal with these kind of situations. So they didn't have a significant incident response or expertise to deal with this, or they had no backup or a cloud hosted solution to maybe manage the impact. So there were a lot of issues in which the city of Columbia, in this case, had to just wait for this DDoS attack to just go away on its own. So then you might ask, like, who is attacked? Right? Everybody is attacked. And imagine Google, Microsoft, Apple, all Facebook, all these big companies that are primarily there serving products online, right? And they are the best targets for these attackers. So how do the big companies deal with this, right? Here's just an example. They use this strategy, which is called Anycast. And if I talk to you, it's a unicast. If I talk to everybody who's accessible through a channel, I call it broadcast. If I talk to a subset of you, it's a multicast. And if I talk to a subset of you in a particular geographic area, it's called a geocast. Anycast is basically where I'm talking to a group, but the one who is able to respond, or I target my response, is the one nearest to me. So in this case, you can see for one of the locations of Google's content is attacked, they make multiple copies of it. So if that content is attacked, the next nearest content becomes available. And so if you have, say, 5 copies, it's very unlikely an attacker has the budget to take down all of your 5 copies. So ultimately, your content does get served by the second or third copy. And so the large companies typically are able to have the ability, they have a defense budget that's greater than the attack budget, and they're able to defend against these DDoS attacks that constantly happen whenever they are trying to be attacked, right? So it's a very easy attack to be launched, like Jason was saying, and they have these kind of defenses in place. But if you're a small business or a medium business, there are other services that you can, resort to. So there's actually this story of mafia attacking a company, and this is a kind of a sales pitch for Cloudflare, and I have nothing to do with Cloudflare, but this is a good service where this cartoon shows you. Without Cloudflare, literally you are exposed, right? You are connected to the internet, like we saw in the group exercise where we're thinking about what kind of attacks, DDoS attacks can happen, and all kinds of attacks can happen. Just the fact you're exposed makes you very likely to be affected. Whereas when you're connected with the Cloudflare network, you essentially have a layer in between the attackers and your protected website that you can filter some of these attacker traffic. So Jason, you have more to say about any of these DDoS scrubbing services like Cloudflare?
I don't really have anything on this service particularly, but one thought that came to mind for some small businesses is, most will host their websites with a third-party vendor, which is great. Don't if you're a small business, don't consider hosting your website in your building, because it's just inviting some very easy DDoS attacks against that website. And as Prasad was saying, is if you're like an e-commerce site, it would pretty much shut you down. So definitely consider that. It's a big threat to host your website inside the structure. So look for some good vendors there. This is the one thought that I wanted to share, Prasad. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Thanks, Jason. And so you can get more fancy, and this is what we call as moving target defense, where you can do what is called as active defense. So you're not basically just waiting to be attacked and finding a solution for it. You could actually be in control of what you're trying to defend. So this is kind of a military term that's used, where if there are the nuclear assets, they don't keep them at one place, they keep moving them, so it makes it harder to locate where the target is for somebody to launch an attack against. So some kind of randomization or obfuscation of what your real assets are that you're trying to protect could help you, and having them be dynamically managed in location, as well as frequency of the migration between locations is an effective strategy. And this is something that's used in defense and other critical enterprises, where it's like a whack-a-mole game, right? If I try to find the target and you move the target away from the attacker has no way to really get your asset, or you could put a fake mole that's not a critical asset, and so you could waste the attacker's budget on things that are not in critical assets. The attacker has to just then give up, because it's harder to find the real targets. So a simple example is it could be like Jason said, your service in a data center at a third party in a virtual machine, and your users could be using it and they're happy with your services and they're able to be productive. And obviously the attacker is trying to take that down, right? And they're going to target your service that's in this cloud location or this third party's data center. And the point here is to have these backup resources or a disaster plan, right? So in case this is happening, how about we find a way to move the target that's a critical web service to a different location, and in some sense have the attacker be stuck with the target he thinks he has compromised, but it's really not affecting your business, and create an illusion for the attacker that, hey, yes, there's a success that, and I've not detected you. Even that could be a way, and or create a sort of a disincentive for the attacker that they just buzz away, right? So there's many of these techniques, they're called defense by pretense and false reality. And so we'll talk about some of these things in these active defense concepts, but the fact is you are deceiving the attacker. This is called cyber deception. And these techniques can be effective. And so I'll show you now sort of a real world demonstration of how this moving target defense can actually be implemented in a cloud solution. So let me bring up this. So Stacy is asking a question. So could the moving target defense be considered similar to a honeypot? That's a great question. Honeypots are kind of a subset of what a moving target defense is. So honeypot is more like a forensic study of an application before it's operationalized, right? So I put something I've developed before actual users come, I put it on a honeypot and I see if it has any vulnerabilities, and people attack it, and I can study what's going on, and then I can fix it before my actual users come. But in today's world, that's not possible because our applications are agile and constantly integrated, right? So we're running applications and we're building them where they're running. And it's not this luxury we have where we can test something out completely differently and then bring it online. We're always constantly adding to what we have. So in that sense, the honeypots are sort of an old technology. In the case that we are talking about, basically making your production systems have the ability to adapt if there's an attack, and finding a way to go to a safe state, and finding, again, like the honeypot does, look a mechanism to lock in the attacker and see what's going on without the attacker knowing you have detected, so that you can patch the rest of the system. So if the attacker is scaling up in terms of the attack in your enterprise, with similar systems, you have a patch going forward. So it is in some sense a honeypot, but the honeypot idea is a little bit of a older way of thinking about applications. Today we are, we call it CI/CD based, right? We have continuous integration, continuous deployment of our applications in the web, and we don't have that luxury to have this isolation of a development and a production system as much. Hopefully, Stacy, that answers your question. That's a great question. Thank you for that question.
And to add to that great answer, Prasad, is it just highlights again a layered approach in any security mindset. So as the honeypot's a subset, as you indicated, having additional measures in place does help your overall defense posture.
Great, thank you. So I'll play this video now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we will be looking at another demonstration in this webinar series where we will be focusing more on the detection and the defense part of the system. For the attack detection, we have a tool called T-Shark, which is a network monitoring tool that monitors any data movement in the cloud network. And for the defense, we will be using the moving target defense concept. Moving target defense is a concept of preventing attacks by moving around VM-hosted services. This can be utilized to perform both proactive and reactive defense methods. We will be looking at a proactive measure where the attacker is directed to a dummy or a decoy server, which mimics the healthcare server. As we see in this image, the attacker is launching the DDoS attack to a main server, which will have to pass through a load balancer. And similar to that, the user also is trying to access the system through the application load balancer. The application load balancer is basically being controlled by a controller manager or a controller which analyzes and decides on where a particular user should be directed to. And based on some attack patterns, the T-Shark tool analyzes. The controller decides the attacker should go to a decoy server, whereas the regular user should go to the main server. Let's look at the healthcare data application. It will be a data request form, which will allow a user to access some information related to healthcare given a certain criteria. As you can see here, there are two different servers in the Amazon Web Services, which is a cloud platform. And these two servers are the virtual machines that we are going to switch depending on a certain traffic. And sitting on top of these two servers is a load balancer, which I will basically use to see what it points to. So before the attack happens, this load balancer should point to the actual server where user can easily access some information or data. I'm going to quickly select some information here. Then I'm going to submit. So as you can see, based on the information that is grabbed from the database, I have fetched these many information. Now let's jump onto the detection part. Here we have an attacker terminal to the left-hand side, where the attacker uses a DDoS tool called slow STTP test. The slow STTP test is going to be used to exhaust the STTP connection request or exhaust the STTP port with a lot of STTP requests. And for this particular example, we're going to use 1,000 connection requests per second. And we will be using the main server address to make this attack. And to the right-hand side, there is a monitoring tool which will constantly monitor once this is executed, whether or not an attack has happened. And the idea behind this thing working is that we have a T-sharp tool that is being used that is constantly logging how many number of connections or packets are being moved into the system. We'll see in a moment how there is a vast difference on how it appears to be before the attack and how it appears after the attack. So there is a certain threshold we are looking at when the system identifies that the number of connections is too much or surpasses a particular threshold. Then what happens is that the controller identifies this as an attack. And once that attack has happened, then the attacker who's using a certain IP address to do this attack will get blacklisted. And then this blacklisted IP address is what is used to do the defense. So let's quickly go over how this works. Initially, I'm going to show you how this T-sharp tool works. Initially, there will be a very small increment of packets being moved into the network. And then whenever I launch an attack, then you'll see an immediate bump on that number. And so we will use the monitoring script that is on the right top corner to kind of identify when there is a certain threshold that has surpassed that an attack has happened and the redirection happens. So let's look at this T-sharp. Initially, you'll see there is not much going. There's just a certain amount of increment, like every 2 packets and so. So first, before we launch an attack, let's monitor now. When I initiate a monitoring, what it does is it just prints if the server is attacked. Now let's see what happens when we attack. So as you can see, there's a quick bump in the number of connections made into the server. And then at a certain point, it will surpass the threshold, which we have used for this demonstration, which will tell the system that the server has attacked. And then you can see the server is not available as on the right-hand side. And then on the controller, you can see the IP address that was captured is this. And then now you can see since the attack has stopped, it's going back to the normal speed. And it's not increasing very rapidly. So this would basically tell the system that the attack has happened, the IP is captured, and that the redirection can happen. I used my local computer to perform that attack, so my attacker IP will basically be the IP address of my computer. And that is the IP address the system should have blacklisted. So quickly, let's copy this load balancer address and then use it on to reload the healthcare application. So as an attacker, if I look into the system, I'll notice that some portion of the portion of the form looks similar, but when they perform certain submission, what happens is that they won't be receiving any of the files or the data that we had loaded earlier. So let's quickly also look at how the users will see how the server behaves for the regular user. You might have noticed earlier that the IP address that was being captured was something that started with 6.7. This is a different IP address because I used a different VPN on my virtual machine that is, running in my computer. And now, if I try to connect to the load balancer, it should behave something like this. So this is the load balancer. Let's see what happens. I will provide some information here and then make a search. So when the regular user uses it, they see that the data that they are looking for, they can easily access that data. Whereas this attacker in my local machine does not. So this is how the system will direct different types of users into different servers, which is the concept of defending through the moving target defense. And using the system, what we have done is we have defended against attacks such as DDoS. And this is the end of demonstration. Thank you.
So hopefully that was some entertaining demonstration of an attack and a moving target defense, right? So let's get back to the slides, right? So we can protect any application that's essentially similar to this application, where it's data coming in, being processed, and you have some access and management of the data processing, some entitlements or privileges we'll talk about. This is where the access control happens, which is the next part we'll talk about. And once the data privileges for processing, viewing, or updating, or deleting are done, the users can then accordingly see them in their workspaces, right? So this is typical to any application that's having a data processing pipeline to create value for their business, right? And so the entitlements is where we'll talk about next, which is where the access controls are. So who is allowed to do what, right? So that's kind of what we'll talk about next. So assigning roles and access controls, and the problem of basically authentication, authorization, which are two different things, right? When you want to protect an asset, we want to first of all know who is accessing it, and that's the authentication part. And then the second part, which is the harder part, which is authorization. What are they allowed to do with that asset, right? And so this decision of what are they allowed to do is, sometimes very difficult. And even the problem of who is it that is accessing a resource, the authentication problem, also can be a problem to deal with. So we'll talk a little bit about these two aspects next. So directory services are kind of common for authentication, and you might have been using Microsoft Active Directory or LDAP or some other way in which you are able to know who is accessing your system, right? You have also Google accounts you could be using, and open IDs that you could be using to essentially figure out who's the person trying to access your systems. So by authentication, we have some confidence about the user identity, and they have some kind of we call it a credential that we're able to authenticate and allow access, right? And authorize them to do certain things. So passwords obviously are a very basic authentication mechanism where we have a username and a password, and it's not a perfect solution, although it is so popular and it is a solution we have so widely adopted. We have seen passwords are easily crackable, right? So it's important to create a strong password, and we all know it, but it's good to keep remembering it. The more complex it is, the more uppercase, lowercase you use, the better. And numbers, special characters are also great. And so you can use this Haystack website I've given here to actually see how strong your password is. And so if you have a password that's 8 to 12 characters, that's usually something that takes thousands of years for a hacker to figure out. So which is a strong password essentially. So you can use some of these tools to figure out, but strong passwords obviously are a friend, but but they're also something that is a vulnerability that's not perfect, right? And so many systems today go beyond just what you know, which is your password. They go with what you have, right? What you possess, like your devices. So we see this two-factor authentication in most email systems, pay systems. There are more advanced ones which are biometric based, and again, you can have something more static like fingerprints, retina face recognition, and you can have something more dynamic, which is voice, handwriting, typing rhythm. So there are other more sophisticated ways, and in essence, we should understand that multi-factor authentication is way better secure than just a password as a single factor, right? So you're having to go through two sets of checks or protections. And so what could be used to get through maybe one part, and then what you have, right, could be then the second part to really pass through to the application that you're trying to protect. So, so Jason, you have something to talk about multi-factor authentication.
Multi-factor authentication, I think, is a must-have layer of security these days. More and more people are becoming accustomed to it with their online banking software requires that. You can, that second factor, like you said, Prasad, is something which is that username and password. The something you possess could be that mobile device where it sends a push notification. You could either push a button, or it's going to send you a text with code in it that you enter the code. It's very simple to use. With any security, you got to get past the pain of multiple layers. The thing about passwords, I'd like to just take a quick step back, is I recommend people think of creating a passphrase. Can help, is one thing, instead of just trying to memorize a bunch of things and change letters or change names of your children or pets occasionally. Come up with passphrases, and passphrases can be something like your favorite song title, favorite book, just maybe even just a string a few choice words together. More nonsensical helps. Last, under the password, is consider a password manager. Those are becoming very popular now. In fact, we're seeing some businesses offer those in their employee benefit perks, along with like identity theft protection. The password managers, you do have to kind of get past the idea of like, well, if I put all my passwords in there, then if they break into that company. So there's that level of trust with that third-party vendor, but it's definitely some things that you can consider there.
Yeah, and there have been incidents where password managers have been hacked. So, but again, as I said, the passwords are good, but again, they are not always the best way to secure our systems. But that's what we're living with today, unfortunately. But but they do work, right? If we are able to have a good discipline about using them. And biometrics, for that reason, are this next level beyond passwords, but they're more technically complex and more expensive, but they provide us, extra security in terms of authentication of individuals, and they're based on certain patterns in our face or fingerprints or such. And ultimately, it comes down to how we manage. The more obfuscation we have, the harder it is to manage, and the cost is also high, right? So you can see here, the accuracy could be lower if it's a signature or a voice. The cost could be lower, but then if you really want very, very high accuracy, the cost is going to be significantly higher. So your solutions will have to, deal with what's the cost you want to associate and the accuracy you want to get. Nevertheless, authentication is a critical step, and as we just saw, it's something that could be compromised, and so paying attention to how you're authenticating, how you're making the authentication decisions is going to be definitely a very important step to giving people access to some of your assets. And the next part, which I said, is authorization, which is even more important, which is once you know who's accessing your assets, and you kind of know that you trust the person who's accessing your assets. Now, assets, what can that person do with your assets, right? What access control do they have? What privileges do they have on the assets? Managing that is even more important and more harder also, right? And you want to do this for your users, your programs, your processes, your systems. And so your security policy has to figure out a way that can regulate authorization of access to the different individuals you are allowing to access your assets. So, there are many technologies in place that you can implement. The basic ones are discretionary access control, and if you have some sort of security clearance kind of a way of doing things, the mandatory access control is great. Role-based access control is by far the most popular way to do things, where you assign roles to your employees, and as long as they fall under certain roles, they are by default given a certain number of privileges. And it's easy in the role-based because if your employees move between roles, or if employees quit, or the management of the access control is much more streamlined and easier. And the most sort of effective, which is attribute-based access control, it's a little bit harder to implement, but that would be the more ideal way if you could do it, right? Is attribute-based access control, where you not only take into consideration the attributes of the user, but also the resource being accessed and some of the environmental conditions. But any of these, again, need not be the only thing you do. You could have a combination of them, and you could have them implemented across different classes of resource based on what you're trying to protect. And to understand the role-based access control a little bit more, and so we have a question here. Do you know the rate of success of breaking a second step in multi-factor? And Jason said, I don't know the success rate, but there have been successful attacks that have bypassed multi-factor authentication. Again, there's not a single tool that will 100% protect you. The layered approach will help reduce the risk, but you will never be at a place of zero risk. Well said, thanks. And that's definitely a sad emoji there. It's not going to be perfect. Thanks, Daniel, for that question. Really appreciate it. And so in the role-based access control, like I said, it's easier to manage, which is why it's more popular. And it kind of works, right? And it's the way we think about people. If they're in a certain role, they have access to certain, privileges, and that management makes it pretty easy to assign roles. And if people, as we said, change from a role to another role, it's easy to manage. Or people quit particular roles, it's easy to manage. And the overhead of maintaining information is much more lesser, right, than doing it at an attribute level, which needs a lot more information to make decisions. So with that, you can see here what you're doing in the role-based is mapping users to certain roles. And they could be in one role or multiple roles usually, right? A CEO can be an administrator as well as an employee. And a technical person could be an administrator as well as a user, right? So you could have different roles like that. And then based on which role you have, you can assign them different resources, functions, processes, devices, and different privileges associated with all of those functions, processes, devices, and resources, right? So it's basically a matrix, right, at the end of the day that you're managing. So I will come to the sort of the last part of our exercise here. So this is something I will stop and let you think about. I'll give you a worksheet, and then we'll do sort of a group reflection. So let me put a link in your chat. So please open this link. It's not any virus or anything like that. It's just a Word document. I always have to say this. And let's look at it for a couple of minutes, right? So this is an exercise to secure a modern small business. So remember, we talked about modern small businesses being, technologically, sophisticated, technology based, and also having distributed expertise. And so how do we think about a security control for a modern small business, right? Where the products are data driven, and also, there is some level of cloud reliance in the small business. So how do we think about security control? So the things we talked about today, right? Authentication. So what are we able to do today as a security control? What can we do in terms of resource management? What are we able to do in terms of data security? What are we able to do in terms of these attacks we talked about that are targeting the loss of availability of our assets or services, or again, the confidentiality or integrity of our applications or services, right? So what do we do in terms of defense as a security control? And the hope is that, we can bring in all that we talked today, right, into this one exercise, right? So we can learn and summarize what we learned today by answering this.
And, real quick on that authentication, number A there, just to add to what we discussed in the multi-factor authentication piece, Prasad, is the executive order that Biden just passed contains a clause in it that all government is going to be mandated to use the multi-factor authentication. So, I think that that's going to be a strong component in that section there.
Great point. And so let's jump into some of the things we can agree upon, right, on that exercise. So as I said, integrity, confidentiality, availability are essentially what they're trying to intrude. And how do we put those security controls, right, are here, right? And like Jason was saying, having some single sign-on multi-factor authentication is going to be a security control. For your resources, making them more on demand. So you don't always run them. You only run them when you need them, and they're monitored and they're taken down when you don't, right? So they're not always running and available as a target. And you can do it across all your systems and applications, right? And also in terms of data security, having this layered approach, right? In protecting your intellectual property with some security controls is going to be critical. And we talked about active defense techniques against moving target defense as a way to protect against, denial of service attacks where a target is attacked, and having more role-based access control so that we can provide as much privileges to the people that we need them to have, and having some way to audit them and manage them effectively, right, as changes happen in an organization. So hopefully those answers were evident to you based on what we discussed today. Thanks for that exercise, and let's conclude, right? Strong. And so, Jason, please jump in. What I'm trying to say here is, like what we said at the beginning, it's about knowing what risk profile you want and knowing what risk you want to mitigate, and coming up with security controls that are at different levels, right? At a resource level in terms of managing the privileges, managing the policies for your firewall or file servers or any other technology you're using to mediate access, and making sure that it's targeted and it is working and it's monitored and it is reducing the magnitude of impact. And ultimately, there is a residual risk, which is what Jason was saying. It's not going to be 100% risk-free, but at least the residual risk that you come up with, you are comfortable with, you can live with it, right? And as a business decision, you go through this process.
Just taking the time to go through a risk assessment helps decisions on where to focus these controls. Obviously, an access control should probably be top of the list for any organization, but knowing what you're trying to protect, then it helps you decide, is that going to be a risk we're going to accept Is it going to be a risk we're going to offload on a third-party vendor? Or is it going to be a risk that we're going to ask for our insurance carrier to cover us in the event? You know, when you understand that risk profile, it does make that decision process a lot easier. It also helps you explain why you're introducing new security controls to all of your employees or vendors. You know, and you can get that clear messaging across as you introduce new controls across the board.
Excellent. And so, yeah, the cost will be a problem. Having a more qualitative or a quantitative solution will be a problem. And your management should be involved in the decision on the security controls. And again, you know, it's a business decision that needs to be planned. And this topic that we've been hitting as a risk assessment exercise is going to be the focus of our next webinar. So I'm so glad that we have prepped, or sort of anticipation for that has been risen through the previous webinars. And so next session, we'll get into all the nitty-gritty and exercises related to risk assessment, getting a risk profile that, like we just talked about, that you're comfortable with, and having some way to you know, have a quantification of that risk, right, that you can monitor. So that's our upcoming webinar, and I really thank you all today for joining us. And if you have any more questions, we're happy to answer. But I appreciate you sticking along with 4 webinars already, and the last one is coming up next Wednesday. So thank you, Jason. Thank you, Brittany.
Yes, thank you, Prasad, and your team. You guys continue to do phenomenal work. So
Yeah, that was very educational. Thank you. And as always, this is going to be recorded, and I'll be sure to share the recorded links with everyone afterwards.
Yes, thanks, Daniel, Stacy, for your remarks, kind remarks. Thank you.